Queen Matilda of Flanders, overshadowed by her more famous granddaughter of the same name, was atypical for a woman of her time. She had immense sway, refusing to be cowed by her often violent Norman husband. She was more than just the wife of the conqueror. She was one of the most influential and powerful women in Europe. And this is her story. The year is around 1050. Possibly 1049, but at 1052-53 at the latest. I say this because dating history in this period is difficult, as events are awfully murky. So we have to make do with what we've got, given what the chroniclers at the time said, and hopefully backed up with archaeological evidence. But anyway, let's get on with the story. Despite setbacks with the Pope, Matilda and Duke William of Normandy are married in the town of Eu on the Norman frontier. And as we learned last time, it was quite the spectacle. Matilda was now betrothed to the most powerful man in Normandy. Both were young, Matilda in her mid to late teens, and William around 20 years old. But the Duke had proven himself in battle, as well as the political arena. And now Flanders was brought into the fold. As the wife of the Duke, Matilda would now be required to travel to Normandy, to start a new life as the Duchess of Normandy, a powerful position. So she made preparations to travel with William to his palace at Rouen. Eu to Rouen is a 50-mile journey that to us in the 21st century is a short drive that takes just over an hour, depending on traffic. Matilda is living in the mid-11th century, so is using the good old horse and wagon method, which is considerably slower. Her journey would have taken a day at the fastest, maybe two if you take into account resting and the like. Also, Matilda wouldn't be alone on this long journey. With her travels her parents, Baldwin V and Adela of Flanders. This was quite the entourage, a convoy consisting of many wagons, containing hangers-on, servants, traders, entertainers, everybody, all pulled by horses and mules. Everything's protected by the well-oiled soldiers of William's elite. There was no mistake as to who was travelling. Oh, and you're not going to be travelling until nightfall, pitching up a tent in some field, and waking up next to a piglet. No, this is the equivalent of Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos. They would be staying in a string of castles and manors that follow the route, complete with feasts and entertainment. After all, this was a joyous occasion, a wedding. And just like our own times, when even a birthday can take a week or so, with friends you haven't seen in a while, who'd meet up with and then buy you a pint, etc. Right, yes, this is a tour of luxury. Although saying that, the soldiers and the like would have to set up in the field, and get woken up by that piglet. Then, the next morning, you'd be back on the road. And finally, they would reach the capital of Normandy, Rouen, to the ducal palace where William resided. Matilda may have been highborn, but Flanders was considered backwater, their yokels. This was Normandy, pretty much the height of culture on the continent, alongside the Franks. Rouen was a grand city, admired by all. It also had a luxurious trade empire, and also knew of foods that came from afar, flanked by hills and forests with the River Seine running through. It was a picturesque affair, and its citizens were rejoicing upon their arrival. And the sheer pageantry lasted for days. Matilda was now the Duchess of Normandy, and it must have taken time for that to sink in. All these lands, everything her eyes saw, belonged to her. Through her husband William, but it belonged to her. As for William, he wasn't out solely to impress Matilda, but her parents, both who remained in Rouen for several days. They were highborn, and this was his moment to shine. Once suitably impressed, Baldwin and Adela headed back for Flanders, leaving William and Matilda to enjoy time together, properly get to know each other. And the first thing this newlywed couple did, it seems, was travel the domains of Normandy, seeing the lands firsthand, taking time to admire this piece of the continent. And the people loved her, this beautiful woman from Flanders. She was given tokens of affection everywhere she went. She was loved by the people. They had not had a duchess for about 25 years, more or less, as William's father never married. And around this time, some other news is brought to light that will change everything. As according to Norman sources, a letter arrives in 1051 from none other than the King of England, Edward the Confessor. Now, as I have stated before, history here is murky. Hence, I cannot tell a straight tale from start to finish in a reliable chronological order. As even though we're told when the letter arrives, and oaths were made, which is 1051, but we don't know the time of the wedding. As I stated at the start of the episode, it could be as early as 1049, could be at the latest 1053, meaning that the letter could very well have already been knowledge of William by the time of the marriage, could be after. We may never know, and that is why last episode I left the timeline at 1051, with some refugees arriving in Flanders from England, and then describing the wedding. So, here we are in 1051, and a letter arrives at William and Matilda's court in Rouen. The letter itself was brought across the channel by Robert de Jumièges, a Norman cleric. He had just controversially been elected to the position of Archbishop of Canterbury in England and was on his way to Rome, passing through Normandy. The contents of the letter were simple. Edward the Confessor was promising the throne of England to Duke William of Normandy. In other words, once King Edward had passed from this world, Matilda could be Queen of England. You see, the situation in England was bad. The kingdom was in crisis, and this had come to a head in 1051. Edward the Confessor was married to Edith, the daughter of Earl Godwin, and they were childless. There was no love for King Edward and Earl Godwin. It was Godwin that handed his brother Alfred to Harold Hereford years ago, who had him blinded and killed. This feud probably was why he wasn't sleeping with Edith, out of spite. And Edward had embarked on a pro-Norman policy, pushing the Godwins further out of power, which included installing Robert de Jumièges as Archbishop. That year, 1051, Earl Godwin, the most powerful man in the kingdom after the king, had fled to Flanders due to this political crisis. The Godwins were already welcome in the court of Baldwin, as by now they'd already given hospitality to Godwin's son Sven, and Matilda's aunt Judith was already married to another of Godwin's sons, Tostig. But the House of Wessex, that is, King Edward of England, distrusted Matilda's father Baldwin. He'd even laid siege to the ports of Flanders when all this kicked off. It was quite the feud. So when Robert de Jumièges arrived in Rouen, in Normandy, he arrives with 2 Saxon hostages to deliver to William, Wulfnoth and Hakon, the son and grandson of Earl Godwin. They were here to make good the English king's promise regarding the content of the letter. And William, who was young and high-spirited, was more than a worthy choice to inherit the throne of England. And it wasn't like he had no claim, as he could trace his lineage to Emma of Normandy and Ethelred the Unready, the King and Queen of England, from the years past. His father's side, bastard he might have been, but his blood was of noble stock, and finally it was all paying off. Another reason for Matilda to have agreed to the wedding? If the letter came before, and she learned William had quite the inheritance. It's all what-ifs and speculation. We do not really know. And we don't even know if the letter story is even true. It's a Norman source, and the letter itself doesn't exist or is lost to history. It may even be a fabrication created to justify the invasion of 1066. I'm assuming that doesn't count as a spoiler, by the way. I'm assuming we know all of this, and for those who don't know, Matilda has just married one of the most famous men in European history, William the Conqueror, although right now they're content with being Duke and Duchess of Normandy. Though I will add that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle does mention this promise, Edward passing the throne to William, and claims that in the year 1051, William sailed to England to meet the king. It claims the king handed him a signet ring and an ornate sword. However, the Norman sources do not mention this, as the Duke has more pressing matters with the borders between Normandy and Brittany. So make of that what you will. A lot of propaganda is going on regarding the crown. And even if King Edward did promise the throne to William, then it would be a hollow victory, as the Godwins controlled most of the kingdom from Kent to Cornwall. And though the Earl was an old man, his sons Harold and Tostig were powerful men, and they'd fight tooth and nail. That they did. As in 1052, just a year later, Earl Godwin was back in England and taken control, and Robert de Jumièges was ousted as Archbishop and replaced by the Bishop of Winchester, Stigand. All of a sudden, William wasn't going to inherit the throne without a fight. But conflict with Earl Godwin and his sons were the last thing on anyone's mind in Normandy, as they had their own problems. The marriage between William and Matilda was supposed to help with tensions between Normandy and France, but this never occurred, despite Flanders having such close connections with the French royal family. If anything, the situation worsened when an alliance is struck between Henri I of France and Geoffrey, the Count of Anjou, another rival on the Norman borders. In fact, the only borders that didn't show aggression to Matilda's husband William was Flanders. But Henri, the French king, was really pushing his luck when he supported rebels within Normandy, namely Archbishop Maugier and William of Arques, Matilda had only just got married, and all of a sudden it looked as if it was all over. Thankfully, her husband was a powerful military leader and quickly went on the offensive, putting Arques to siege. The French king sent an army to drive off the aggressive Normans, but were utterly crushed by Duke William's forces. The rebellion was short-lived, and the two miscreants, Monsieur and Arques, fled the domain. Banished. They would never return to Normandy, ever again. If Matilda had any doubts as to the competence of William's military prowess, it ended there. Henri of France would try again to wrest Normandy from him, only to suffer defeat again in 1054, despite being aided by Geoffrey of Anjou. However, for Matilda, it wasn't solely about warfare. These victories, as good as they were causing tensions in her own family back in Flanders. After all, they still had strong ties to France, and the marriage was supposed to ease tensions, not escalate them. Especially when Matilda showed people just how headstrong she was when she backed up her husband in his politics, rather than side with Henri or her father and get William to step down. After all, women were seen as peacemakers and diplomats in a time where men were aggressive and warlike. It's not me saying that, that's the chroniclers. Chroniclers that don't consider this a bad thing. She was raised to be the perfect wife and consort, forever loyal, and she was playing her part beautifully. Too well, in fact. Remember, this is Matilda of Flanders. Just because she's married, it doesn't strip her character, and she'll use this stubborn streak as the role of Duchess in the coming years. As she wasn't supporting her husband out of some archaic law, no. She knew they made a good power couple. William did too. He was famously impressed by the way she worked the courts. And with marriage came a child in 1053. A son named Robert. I'll be using the English terms for the Williams and Matilda's family. Named Robert after William's father and Matilda's grandfather. Already the poor kid's got the cards stacked against him because William's father, Robert, was known by the French as the Devil, and Matilda's grandfather was the French king, Robert the Pious. Polar opposite role models, and all the people would be wondering what path the child would take, the good or the evil. Unfortunately for the poor lad, his father never took to him. The Duke called him Short-Boot because of his height, or Coteuse, as it became his moniker. He was harsh towards the boy, very strict, even for the time. Not Matilda though, she loved Robert Coteuse with all her heart, devoted to him. And this began to create seeds of discord between William and Matilda, as their approach to Robert's upbringing was so drastically different. I will stress that in their case, this discord only strengthened the marriage. As I said, they are the power couple. What William made up in military prowess, Matilda made up on the courts of the land, as she's ever the diplomat. Now, this day and age isn't without its setbacks in pregnancy, with many complications. Though none of these are recorded, we simply do not know if Matilda had any miscarriages or stillbirths. We cannot assume that there were none, though there is nothing saying this had to be the case. She could have just had pregnancies as normal. What we do know is that as the years passed, Matilda would have 8 children that are recorded. 4 boys, 4 girls. And we know the relative order. The next to come was Richard. Then Adeliza, Cecilia, and then William. Though, to avoid confusion with his father, I'll be referring to the younger William by his nickname, given to his ruddish hair, Rufus. During the 1060s there would also be Constance, Adela, and Henry. There may have been another 2, like Matilda and Agatha, but these cannot be confirmed, so I'm not adding them for the course of this series. I will just state that. Matilda is building up quite the brood, and 2 of her sons would become kings, and the girls just as powerful. 2 of them become duchesses and countesses. As far as public opinion was concerned, Matilda had completed her obligation in providing heirs to the duchy, which was pretty good, given the church was fully in support of annulment should she not fulfil this duty, and society completely backed this up. A sexist notion in today's mind, but normal for the 11th century, and if women couldn't provide a male heir, they typically got the blame, not the man. This was still very much a man's world. Women would still have a long way to go in terms of equality. And I'm not saying it's perfect these days either. Either way, Matilda was pretty busy around this time with the many children that would make up the household. And unlike many women of the noble classes, she didn't appear to suffer from any anemia or other medical setbacks. So she was most likely having the right amount of proteins keeping her healthy. The babies seemed healthy also, at a time where around 15 to 20% of infants had died of complications in the first year. Over a quarter would die before they were 20, like with Richard, but we'll get there when we get there. And infancy was pretty similar than what we see today, starting at birth and ending around 7, and then he became a child. This went on till around 14, and then he became an adolescent until you're around 20. Part of the 6 stages of life, as dictated by Isidori in the 7th century. As for raising children, the idea of passing the infants off to a maid or other servant wasn't really around at this point. And Matilda would be the one doing this, though no doubt with help, mainly from her mother Adela, and her stepmother Herleva, who was said to have been at court during this time. Herleva lived there. And there would most certainly be a wet nurse, as breastfeeding was frowned upon in this case, as it hindered contraception. The more babies, the merrier. Wet nurses tended to be other noble women who were breastfeeding, thus didn't mind adding another baby to the queue. Also, you'd have some segregation occurring when it came to the upbringing of the infants, as the father would be taking over most of the role models for the boys as they got older. Mothers for the girls. The boys were expected to be able to fight, ride horses into battle, and understand military tactics, as well as courtly decisions. Masculine behaviour was strongly encouraged. The girls were expected to understand needlework, the running of the household, general cliché girly things, if you know where I'm going, while groomed to be the perfect wife. The feminine qualities were encouraged. Although this is Matilda we're talking about, and history tells us that she took an active role in the son's tutelage as well. And these boys were also raised alongside other boys of the Norman high nobility. And in this era, the concept of chivalry is sort of taught, although not at the level you would see in later centuries. As the boys grow up, they'd be given one of 2 paths, military or the church, and they didn't have much of a choice in this, both which often crossed career paths as well. You had fighting bishops, and you had knights who also were part of the church, and both required serious training around the age of 12 and onwards, on top of liberal arts like reading, writing, in French, Latin, and in this case Flemish, and you would also be required to understand the scripture. Matilda didn't shy them away from court either. She made sure they saw the signing of charters, the diplomacy, and the ins and outs of courtly life. Though the boys were not encouraged to marry at this point. Other boys might be, but not this particular household. If anything, it seemed to be the last thing on William's mind, much like his father beforehand. Unlike the daughters, who were very much groomed to marry, as was the custom. In fact, the girls' choices were also pretty narrow. On one hand, you had the church, in this case the nunnery. On the other hand, you had the housewife. Even for a woman in the noble household, she'd still be expected to look after the home, albeit with a gaggle of servants and other staff. When it came to educating the girls, we know that Matilda employed a man by the name of Arnulf of Chox to be the schoolmaster of Cecilia. He's from Flanders, and a very respected scholar. And this alone tells us that the daughters had a high education in the liberal arts. They would also learn Latin, writing and logic, as well as the art of persuasive speaking. After all, women played a diplomatic role in society, especially at these high levels. Add to this, the chroniclers say that the girls were beautiful and chaste, the perfect example of an 11th century noble woman. Overall, the household was sound of mind, as the babes left infancy and entered childhood. Robert Curthose, being the oldest, began showing some of the character he'd been known for. He's impatient, hot-headed, and argues with his tutor when he declares that he hasn't come here for a lecture. It was becoming clear he was not going to be obedient, and no manner of beatings would curb his character. As he got older, he would be prone to sin, especially of the flesh. However, the worst by far was William Rufus. Right now he's only an infant, but as he grows up, he'll show a cruel and nasty streak. He'll apparently relish in sin, and was disliked by many. His cynical sense of humour, rubbing people up the wrong way. His tutor was Lefranc of Bec, the priest who initially opposed the marriage of William and Matilda, but changed his mind after a persuasion. And now this firebrand cleric is the tutor of Rufus. Also, on Rufus, there is more than a lot of evidence to suggest that he was homosexual. Far more than idle speculation. Not saying that's what gave him his bad character, nothing of the sort. He's just was. That's how the dice fell. And by the way, when I say bad character, we're not talking a psychopath like Caligula. Just a cynical brute with a raging temper and a cruel mindset, much like his father, William the Conqueror. Also, don't think that Rufus is some dainty man like some effete Hollywood cliché. No, he was tall, heavily muscled, bear of a man, with a deep booming voice. Now I'm imagining Brian Blessed, if anyone. Now I mention these two, Robert and Rufus, out of all the others, as these will have the largest impact in history. You see, Duke William poured all his adoration onto his younger son, Rufus. They were very much alike, while Matilda adored her firstborn son, Robert. And this will cause some more tension in the household. But that's getting a bit ahead of ourselves, because right now they are just mere boys, playing with wooden swords and climbing trees. And I'm not ready to skip pages of Matilda's history to focus on these two scallywags. And there's a third scallywag in this, young Henry. Technically, he has the most impact on history. But if it wasn't for Robert and Rufus, no one would have heard of Henry. Now, Matilda is first and foremost a politician, if we are using today's terms. She's the Duchess, and is helping Duke William assert his power. This meant ruling over the other nobility, who controlled the castles and the manors that made up the territories of Normandy. And after a series of military victories, they had firmly established themselves against the enemies of the borders. All ran from the ducal courts that toured the land. And in this, Matilda was crucial. You see, William was a brutish military man who was surrounded with like-minded men who preferred war and might. He's a bully. He lives a boisterous life that encouraged roughhousing and violence. Even the poets that attended the Duke's court preferred to recite bawdy songs and crude rhymes over the eloquent romantic verse that Matilda would prefer. But do take in mind that these people considered Flanders as backwater and yokel. Were these brutes atypical of the era, or was Flanders worse? And Matilda certainly knew her way around this often chaotic court. But if anything, she was setting the tone, raising the quality of etiquette, and dragging them out of the so-called Dark Ages and into the High Medieval. And I'm not doing William dirty, this was his character. But he was also a religious man who didn't take mistresses. He loved literature. And during this period, outside of minor discord regarding the children, the couple got along. He was building monasteries and churches. But Matilda would be the one organising the lavish banquets, a staple part of noble life, with diverse foods from far and wide, complete with entertainment. And often this would be dropped on her at the last minute. Imagine that! The day's going on as normal, you're with the children, enjoying embroidering. And then in comes the Chamberlain, waggling a letter, explaining that the Duke is returning from Poitou with the Duke of Brittany, and you've now got a day to arrange the trestle tables to accommodate 50 drunken knights. Oh, and to troll the court to see what entertainment is available, and hope that the farter hasn't left town, as last time he went down well. In other words, a regular Tuesday for Matilda. Also, religion was a huge part of courtly life, with fast days on Wednesdays and Fridays, where fish was greatly encouraged, where saints' days were observed all throughout the year, as everyone was a devout Catholic. The fear of damnation was in everyone's minds, especially in the high echelons of society, where Pope Leo was only a letter away. And often, events in far-off lands have an impact nearer home. Like the death of Pope Leo in 1054. Right, we'll have to explain this. You see, the church wasn't quite the single unified unity it wanted you to believe. There had been tensions between the Eastern and Western Europe since the days of Diocletian, when the Roman Empire split into two. There are many theological arguments from original sin to eating unleavened bread, and all these arguments have been raging behind the scenes for a long time, and all the way through Matilda's tale. And in 1054, the tension broke, and Cardinal Humbert, a Benedictine monk, marches into the Hagia Sophia, the largest church, the head of Constantinople, with an army of clergy, and lays down 12 charges against the Patriarch there, laying the letter on the great altar itself, before excommunicating said Patriarch, Michael Cerularius. And in response, Michael Salarius declared the Roman Catholic Church a heresy. The gloves were off. It's all kicking off now. He closes all the Catholic churches in the region. This schism would have affected everything from trade to diplomacy, because although no armies are marching across Europe, the clergy are being deliberately petty, making it awkward for everyone. But the next pope, Victor II, would not last long, and Stephen, the pope after that, would only last a year. And negotiations with the Eastern Church were only worsening. Now, in 1059, two powerful men now vied for the position of Pope. Girard of Burgundy, he was one. He's the Bishop of Florence. The other, Giovanni, a Bishop of Velletri, and a Cardinal. All of a sudden, the matters of the clergy became a matter for the nobility across Western Europe, and soon William and Matilda had become involved.